Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our session. So for the next 30 to 40 minutes, we're going to run through Microsoft licensing. So what are we going to cover today? Let's talk a little bit of a few seconds of why we need to have a licensing plan. Let's see about Windows Server licensing and the CALs that go along with it. As I said, we'll talk about SQL, System Center, and a few other things that are part of this licensing that is related to virtualization and software assurance. Now, today, why are we saying let's go for having a licensing plan? So what is a licensing plan in essence? A licensing plan is basically that meant for organizations. It's a plan that organizations should have about how you're going to use the right Microsoft licenses and use them efficiently. Okay. So the one thing we've noticed today is that Microsoft is there in almost every corporate space. Okay, in every space of our lives today, we are using Microsoft in one way or the other. Okay, on definitely at our offices, we are using Microsoft products. Okay, the planning stage and the 3 points, the three key points of why we are looking at planning to have the right Microsoft licenses is first is legal compliance. Now, to put it to you in simple form, if you're an organization that sells any kind of products in the market, right? You don't want somebody else to come in and make a copy of that and sell for cheaper or something. So best is to always ensure that as far as compliance is concerned within the organization, okay, in terms of the number of licenses that you bought, because you are doing business legitimately, so it's best to always have to always be legally compliant in terms of the licenses that you buy. It also helps that when you plan, when you have a proper licensing plan, you can also budget for it. Okay, you know how much licenses are going to cost. People have the pricing available to them, partners they do, distributors they do. And when you when you have a plan in place, it also then you can also see where you can scale up and where you can be flexible. But Microsoft licensing today is one of the things that you'll see when you go for concepts, when we touch on concepts like software assurance, where especially the scalability and the flexibility portions come into play. So let's understand where we have about our different licensing concepts on the three technologies that we're going to look at, okay, and the benefits that they offer. Now, Windows Server as a product was released way back in the year 1993 as Windows NT 3.1. Now, for those people who are familiar with Windows Server and its long history, it essentially came apart from a joint venture that Microsoft had with IBM in the late 80s, early 90s as a concept product called as OS2. And when the partnership broke up, Microsoft then went and tailored the software and converted it. And today is what we call as Windows. It was called as Windows NT 3.1. Today we call it as Windows Server. Now the general release cycle of the product is once every 3 years. With every 6 months, you get a major update in that. And the current release version, as we know, is been launched since August 2021. Version is 2022. Now, unlike some of the earlier versions of Windows Server, where we used to have multiples of them, especially when 2008 came out, today, today Windows Server comes only in three simple editions, and that's been the form that's been going on since version 2016. We have Data Center Edition, we have Standard Edition, and we have Essential Edition. So if you look at this table here on the screen, you can see exactly how we've taken care of the licensing model. Okay, so Data Center Edition gives you and Standard Edition, you need core-based licensing along with the client access license. Essentials is only sold by the OEM. So when we say sold by the OEM, means it comes pre-installed from the hardware manufacturer. Okay, the license type here is a core license, whereas in Essentials, it's a single license that's tied to the hardware. As far as your operating system environment and Hyper-V containers are concerned, okay, you can have virtually unlimited number of virtual machines. So the OS is for virtual machines and one Hyper-V container. We'll come to the containers part in a bit. Okay, and the Windows Server containers that you can have is unlimited. Okay, we'll touch base on that in the coming slides. Now, when we talk about core-based licensing under Windows Server, okay, what that means is that on today all servers, all hardware today come with processors which have multiple cores available on those processors. Okay, servers come with minimum 4 to 8 cores worth of processors, whereas your laptops and desktops come with minimum 2 to 4 cores of processors. Now, the minimum each core license, okay, covers 2 physical cores of your processor. Okay, so and for the minimum number of licenses that we need to buy for the server, is to cover a 16 core physical box, which means we need to buy 8 core licenses at the very minimum. Okay, so if you look at this table, you see out here for one processor server, which has 2 physical cores, the minimum number we still need to buy is for a 16 core box, and the number of two packs we need to buy is 8. When we say 2 pack, means that the 2 pack license covers two cores of the processor. So this is a very bare minimum that we need. Only when you come down to the 8 physical cores per processor, you'll see that for when we come to the two processor server, that's your 2 socket server and a 4 socket server. Okay, that's when the numbers start going up. Um, Now, see the slide for 10 physical core. See this last row of where we say we have 10 physical cores per processor. So when we're looking at two socket servers, so that means we have a total of 20. We have a total of 20 processors, 20 cores. So we need 10 licenses, and we have a 4 socket server with 40 cores. So we need 20 licenses. So very simple. The when your calculations are number of cores divide by 2, but the minimum number should be 8 core licenses per physical server. If you have less than 8, your minimum number is 8. If you have more than 8, okay, then the number of licenses you need to buy is that number. Now, the one thing that Windows Server 2022 has brought out is that earlier versions of Windows Server, we used to be able to license only at the physical layer. Now, when I say license at the physical layer, which means that the license of the operating system has been tagged to the hardware. But now, Windows Server 2022 has brought about a change in the licensing where you can also now license as per virtual machine. Okay, so when you're talking about licensing at the physical layer, okay, your standard edition allows for installation at the as the host operating system plus 2 virtual machines, okay, with unlimited virtual containers without Hyper-V isolation. Okay, now when we talk about Hyper-V isolation, and so with Hyper-V isolation, you have basically it's a feature where you can run multiple container instances on a host. Okay, but the thing is that each container runs inside of a virtual machine. So because of which you have to and it basically what it does is it gets its own kernel. Now that means that when we run, because it runs on its own virtual machine, that means we have to follow the rules of virtualization out here. So standard edition offers only 2 virtual machines out here. When you talk about data center edition is basically those meant for highly clustered virtualized environments. Okay, that's why we offer unlimited virtual machines on that and unlimited Windows Server containers without Hyper-V isolation. Now, when you're talking about licensing in a virtual environment, so if you're creating a virtual machine in on any hypervisor and you only want to license that one single virtual machine, so if you have an environment where you have maximum non-Microsoft virtual machines, but you want to introduce 1 or 2 virtual machines running on Microsoft Windows Server, you can go ahead and do so, and you can license only those particular virtual machines. Okay. So when we do that, we have to basically run the same rules of the core counts. So that means out here the minimum core counts we have to take is for an 8-core license and for a minimum of a 16-core socket box. Okay, same thing with data center edition as well. Now, when we're talking about on-prem licensing, essentially what happens is that we need, as far as Windows servers is concerned, we need to have what are known as access licenses. Now, this is whether the server is deployed physically in a physical box or is a part of a virtual environment. Now, access licenses are of 2 types out here. One is the what we call as the client access license. Now, those are essentially meant for our internal users. Okay, now internal users are classified as the core employees, the full-time employees of that organization, or affiliate employees. And when we call as affiliate employees, that means those people who are temporary employees, outsourced employees, or what you call as outsourced employees. Okay. Now, both type of these access licenses have something called as the base license and something called as additive licenses. Now, base license basically means that those are the compulsory licenses that you need to buy to access Windows Server. And on top of that, some of the features that Windows Servers offers, some of the extra features, for those you would need additive licensing. And these licenses can be bought under both the device type as well as user type. Now, where do we talk about device and user cals? So say, for example, a device cal would actually work in an environment where you have lesser number of devices and more number of people, right? So when you talk about device cal, as I was saying, for device cal, for those environments, like for example, BPOs, KPOs, where you have people coming in shifts, but there are two or three people would be you would be using the same device. So that's when we talk about having a device cal. Now you have to remember one thing, that even in today's day and age, where uh, a person can have more than one device. Like for example, you would have an office laptop. Okay, senior people would even have devices like tablets, and of course, everyone would have mobile phones. So if you're going to be accessing any system inside your office network that is going to be hosted on a Windows server, you need to ensure that your CALs are ready with that. Okay. Now, when we talk about user cals, here, if you have more number of devices as compared to a number of users, then a user cal makes sense. Because in this case, what would happen is that n number of one user can have n number of devices. Moving on. So, right now, coming to the where cals are required, internal cals are required. So as I explained earlier, it is for internal employees. Affiliate employees are basically what we call as your outsourced employees, and contract employees or agents. And we also have for web server for external connectors. Okay, as we saw earlier, external connectors essentially are for these people who are not under these three classifications. External connectors are required for people who are of general public. Okay, like say for example, a bank hosts their net banking website. Net banking website will be accessible to everybody everybody around the world. Anybody can go to any website and type their name. Okay, now that doesn't mean that obviously we need to buy a CAL for those people. Microsoft has a concept of what is called as external connector license. Okay, now external connector license are essentially meant for those people who are not coming under these three classifications. Okay, anybody who's not legally required, who does not legally work for that organization, their license is covered by what is called as external connector license. Now, the thing about external connector license is that we have to buy only one per server, where the server is directly or indirectly accessed. Okay, and when I say directly or indirectly access, means when you're hitting a server like a web server which has a front end web page, that is called as direct access. When when that website is accessing a database server in the backend, that is called as indirect access. When the website authentication happens through maybe Active Directory, again that is called indirect access. So the server only needs one external connector license that covers basically the whole Amjanta of the world. Okay, now we talk about the advanced functionality in client access license. Okay, so Microsoft Windows Server has quite a lot of additional features aside from just hosting simple things like Active Directory and file server. You have things like rights management services, you have remote desktop services. So those are called as advanced functionalities. Okay, and those require their own additional cals for it. So what you call as the additive cals. And this would be mutually exclusive to the base cal. So if you have the base cal, that doesn't give you advanced cal functionality, but to even enable advanced cal functionality, you need to ensure that you have your base cals in place. Okay, so additive cals sit on top of your base cals. So same thing when it comes to external connectors as well. Okay, so just giving you a brief structure what we saw. We have your remote desktop services, rights management, identity management. Okay, so if it's an internal user, so obviously you're going to have a cal for that. Okay, your Windows Server basic cal is called as your base cal, and all the other your advanced functionalities are called as additive cals. So it can be a per user or per device. Only your identity manager is a per user license, and this can be in a mix and match mode also. You can have some kind of you can have your Windows cals as per user, and you can have your RDS and rights management cals as a per device cal also. Same thing on the external connector as well. But here, if you see external connectors only per server, that means you only need to buy one per server. Okay. So for different editions, so you see the cals that we have are available only for your data center and standard edition. So if you notice out here, data center does not give you remote desktop services, does not give you identity management services. The only thing that Essentials Edition has is your rights management. And even, okay, and same thing for external connector also. Those cals are available, all your base and additive cals are available for both standard and data center. In Essentials, the only thing you get is rights management. because Essentials itself does not even have RDS services. Okay, and as far as the main Windows services are concerned in Essentials, you don't need the CALs for that because you'll literally be physically limited to only up to 10 users accessing that server. Now, when you come now, there is an option where you can have what is called as a downgrade. Okay, so if the current right now the current version that you would buy is server or version 2022, that can be downgraded all the way down to the first edition, that is Windows even NT 3.1 also. Okay, hypothetically speaking, if anybody has a server running that old, they can go ahead and they can use that. They can use your current CAL on that server as well. Okay, so whichever CAL version that you have, be it 22, 19, or 16, you are limited only up to that version, corresponding version of Windows Server. So the moment you introduce the next version or the next version of Windows Server in the organization, so for example, if all this while you've been running Windows Server 2016 and you have all the CALs available for it, okay, but the moment you introduce a Windows Server 2019 or 2022 edition into your network, you have to legally go ahead and upgrade all your CALs, buy a whole set of new CALs for that Windows Server 2022, especially if it is going to be a core server like your Active Directory server or a file server that is accessible by everybody. Okay, so that covers Windows Server and Windows Server CALs. And now we move to SQL Server. Okay, now with SQL Server, the product was essentially launched way back in the year 1989 as this predates the launch of even Windows Server also. So you remember I spoke about OS2. Okay, now the release cycle has not been very uniform. So roughly within 2 to 3 years, sometimes they launch. So there was a time when they launched their first edition of SQL that was in version 2017, and already a year before that they had SQL 2016. So sometimes that can they don't have a uniform launch cycle. Now there are 4 editions of SQL Server. Okay, your current version is 2022, launched in November of last year. It was a bit late on the launch as well, but it's also available now. In this case, since 2017, it's been available both for Windows as well as for Linux. Okay, so you have 4 flavors. You have Standard Edition, which is meant for mid-tier applications. You have Enterprise Edition for high scale-out applications, and definitely for higher configuration of hardware. Express Edition is a small free available version which provides databases up to 10 GB in size. And you have Developer Edition, which is a free edition for developers, which is essentially nothing but Enterprise Edition. Okay, the Developer Edition and Enterprise Edition are identical. The only difference is that Enterprise Edition you can use for production environment, and Developer Edition you can use for test and dev environments. No limit to the number of deployments that you can do for Developer Edition. Now, as you can see out here, the licensing for SQL is for enterprise is only a core-based license. And for standard edition, you can do a server cal model as well as a core-based model. So what's the difference out there? Now in SQL, one thing you have to remember, when you're buying SQL licenses on core base, okay, you do not need to buy CALs unlike Windows Server. So in Windows Server, even though the licensing is core based, you still need to buy the client access license. In SQL, your license can be core based, but in this case, you do not need to buy you do not need to buy CALs out here. Okay, core based licensing in SQL allows for unlimited user connections, both within the organization as well as outside the organization. So like where Windows Server had an external connector license for people accessing from outside the organization, SQL does not have external connector funder at all. All you need to do is buy core-based license that covers not only both your internal users, it also covers users outside the organization. Now, standard edition is available in a server cal model as well. So irrespective of whether your server is running 1 cal or server's running server's running 1 core or 16 cores, your server license will cover all those cores. Okay, but you need to buy cals. Now, the tipping point where we say go for a core-based license as compared to a server cal model, okay, is that your 4-core license plus 35 cals works out to the same. 35 your server license plus 35 cals works out to the same as a 4-core license SQL Server Standard Edition. SQL being an application server can be licensed at the physical layer as well as at the virtual layer. And as I mentioned before, core-based licensing is not required if you're running if your core licensing does not require cals, unlike server cal model. And I also mentioned before that your core licensing allows for unlimited client connections, both internally as well as externally. And the minimum number of license you need to cover is for a 4-core server. So each license covers 2 physical cores, whether it's 2 physical or 2 virtual cores. This is the your minimum number of license you need to buy. And the same rule applies for containers. So if you look at this, small tables out here, okay, this one here where I have one physical hardware and I've got 3 different virtual machines, I need to license per virtual machine. But if I've got hardware and I've got OS and I'm doing virtualization at the containerization at the OS level, where I've got 3 different applications, there I need to buy only for this particular OS. So moving to System Center, okay, and this is where it gets simplified. Microsoft has simplified this. Okay, it was released way back in 1994 as a product called a System Management Server, which was just for endpoint management. And then in 2008, Microsoft expanded the entire range to Configuration Manager, which is your endpoint manager service, Data Protection Manager for backup. Okay, and the endpoint manager here again, don't get confused with Configuration Manager, but endpoint manager here is for security. Operations manager is for server operations, so you can automate, you can monitor the entire environment. Orchestrator is for creating runbooks for server automation. Okay, service manager is kind of like a help desk tool, and virtual machine manager, as the name suggests, manages your entire virtualized environment. Now the release cycle is exactly on Windows Server. So the moment Windows Server launches, within a month or two, your System Center also launches. So the current version is 2022, identical to Windows Server. Okay. Again, even the additions here are identical to your Windows Server. That is, you get standard and you get data center. Now, when you buy a license of System Center, okay, the core license of System Center, it covers all these 7 products. There's no individual licensing available for that. Okay. The licensing is also available for standalone as well as for virtualized environments. Okay, so whether if you have one server, if you have just one server, which is a file server, standalone file server, and AD server, you can buy it for that. Or if you've got a virtual environment in there, you've got one physical box which has got 10 VMs in there, and depending on the base edition of Windows Server that you tag to the hardware, you also can tag the same edition of System Center to that, and that covers all the rights. That gives you the same rights, the System Center rights, access rights, as your Windows Server license rights. Now, the one thing that Microsoft has also given out here is that for every System Center deployment that you do, you get a free SQL Standard Edition 4-core license available only for use with System Center. Okay. So for now, one thing you mentioned, I've not mentioned here is what are the server licenses. So in this case, in System Center, there is no server license product as such. You only have the CALs that you buy. Okay, the CALs are also licensed in the same way as you license for Windows Server Standard and Data Center Edition. Okay, moving to our next topic, and this is the one which actually takes up more time than anything else, is virtualization rights. Now, as you saw in our Windows Server slides, one thing that Windows Server 2022 has provided is that you can that you can license not only at the physical layer, but you can also license at the virtual layer. Now, if your environment is predominantly Windows, okay, then what we always recommend is license at the physical layer. Now, when your licenses are tagged to the physical layer, those licenses cannot move across hosts. Okay, so when we'll see this in a scenario when we come later, okay, as in a few slides. But just remember this, that when your licenses are tagged to the physical server, those licenses cannot migrate. Now, an application license like SQL Server, as you see out here, those can be migrated when the control of the virtual machine moves from one physical host to another. Now, when you talk about Windows Server licensing, your standard edition offers you 2 virtual machines per license set. So which means that for a 16 core server, your 8 licenses that you buy, those allow you to install not only for the base operating system, but also for 2 additional virtual machines. For 2 virtual machines. Now, if I want to create additional virtual machines, so the box that I bought is a very high powered box. It's got quite amount of RAM, so I can actually install more than 2 virtual machines. So if I want to license those additional virtual machines, what I need to do is I need to relicense all my cores again, physical cores. So we call that as license stacking. So essentially, this is the base licenses that we buy for our server. Okay, the 8 licenses. On top of that, if I want to add 2 more virtual machines, I have to buy 8 more licenses. Okay, that gives me a total of 4 virtual machines. If I want to have up to 8 virtual machines in total, I need to add 2 more stacks. So I have my base license plus I have 3 more license stacks on top of that. So which is why when we say, when you're going for heavily clustered environments, okay, or heavily virtualized environments, even on a standalone server, go for data center edition. Sorry, this should be reading data center edition, not enterprise edition. Go for data center edition, which allows for unlimited virtual machines, right? And on the SQL edition also, we have something similar in terms of for enterprise edition licenses. So if I have a base Windows server running data center edition, on that base server, I can tag a SQL enterprise edition to it. And if I've licensed all the physical cores of that server with data center edition of Windows Server and SQL Server Enterprise Edition, I can create an unlimited number of virtual machines on that physical box that run Windows and SQL Enterprise Edition equal to the number of core licenses I buy. So look at this last line. If a 4 processor server with four cores per processor, that means a total of 16 cores are licensed. So I can create a total number of 16 SQL virtual machines, irrespective of the number of virtual cores I assign to each VM. So whether I assign one virtual core or I assign 8 virtual cores, I can create 16 VMs in there. If my base server has been licensed with Windows Server Data Center Edition and SQL Server Enterprise Edition. Okay, this is again this particular virtualization right is only available with Enterprise Edition of SQL. And coming to our last topic, which is software assurance benefits, which was basically, it was a program started way back in the year 2002. Okay, this is an additional, this is a maintenance program. It's bought as an add-on to your base licenses when you buy. And these are some of the key benefits that you get as part of your software assurance benefits. There's actually more, but I've listed some of the more important ones. So most importantly, we get is that when the next, so when you are buying your licenses with software assurance, it's a maintenance program. So essentially, what you're also buying is the rights to use the next version if it is launched in the middle of your software assurance payment cycle. Now, what we call a software assurance payment cycle is that the software assurance benefits is roughly 80% of the cost of your main licenses, and that has to be clubbed together. That cost has to be paid in either a 2 or 3-year program cycle. Okay, so if you have a software assurance program that's running as a 3-year cycle, what happens is that within those 3 years, if any new version of that particular software that you've tied the software assurance benefits to, if that is launched, say for example, Windows Server right now is 2022, which was launched last year. Say hypothetically speaking, this is May of 2022, not 2023. So the current edition of Windows Server available is 2019. So if you buy Windows Server 2019 with software assurance, okay, in November when version 2022 comes around, we can go ahead and we can upgrade to version 2022 free of cost because we have already prepaid for that as part of our software assurance benefits. We also get something as a desktop optimization pack and virtual desktop access rights. So basically allowing your end users to access virtual desktops and create virtual machines on their local machine, right? We also have something called as Windows Enterprise add-on. So the add-on is like you have your Pro edition of Windows Server, which is either a paper license or an OEM license. And on top of that, you can then perform an in-place upgrade to Enterprise edition of Windows Server. And these are some of the these are some of the other rights. Most important one you have to remember is you get disaster recovery rights in the sense that you can deploy the same license that you bought for your primary data center into your secondary data center, which you're using for a DR site. Okay. You also have the option for step up. Now, when we call a step up, it means that you're going up for off an edition. So for example, right now, if you're using, say, Windows Server Standard Edition, and you want to step up to Data Center Edition of Windows Server. So the only thing you need to do is you need to pay the difference in the cost of Standard and Data Center Edition. And as I explained earlier, that because this is a multi-year program, so basically you split the payments across 2 or 3 year cycle, depending on what you want. Most people go for a 3-year payment cycle on this one. So this essentially brings us to the end of the discussion points that we've targeted for today's webinar. Thank you, everybody. And we are running a similar webinar next month on cloud-based licensing as well. So do join us then and hope to see you for that as well.